Hey, welcome to this week's episode of The People's Report, news for the left, brought to you by Solidarity TV. Today is December 17th, 2025. Who won the Chilean election, a communist or a Nazi? What does the Trump administration not want you to know about climate change? Would the company you work for cut executive bonuses to give you and your coworkers a $900 bonus? Who collapsed the Bulgarian government? The UK wants to emulate Denmark's hard asylum model, but what does that actually look like? Why has Illinois approved medically assisted suicide? Which country is being threatened by its greatest ally, the United States? Where have the American pirates struck this time? Why has global media turned tragedy into Zionist propaganda? How many new Israeli homes will be forcibly built in the West Bank? And what does that mean for the Palestinians who already live there? Would your social media accounts prevent you from entering the United States? Do you and your community want to regulate AI? Donald Trump doesn't care. All these topics and more in tonight's episode of The People's Report. Timestamps in the episode description.
Well, don't feel so devastated if you're feeling alienated, cause it turns out you're not alone. Just open up your heart, let the revolution start, and grab that megaphone. Solidarity, solidarity, I need you and you need me. Solidarity, 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 solidarity.
Kast wins Chile and the far right takes presidency for the first time since the return to democracy, December 15, 2025 via E.P.A. Chile elected its next president on Sunday, José Antonio Kast, a 59-year-old lawyer and leader of the far-right Republican Party, who won with 58.1% of the vote, with 99% of the ballots counted. His opponent in the runoff election, the communist Janet Jara, a 51-year-old lawyer and left-wing candidate, garnered 41.3%, the worst result for progressives since the return to democracy in 1990. The victory marks the arrival of the first leader who has not distanced himself from the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet to La Moneda Palace, where he will succeed Gabriel Boric, a leading figure of the new left who will step down at the age of 40. Kast's victory not just consolidates the conservative shift in the country, but also in much of South America, and puts Chile's institutional framework into the test, since it remains unclear how radical the policies Kast plans to implement from March 11th will be. In any case, his phone call with President Boric was cordial in tone. At some point, you too will come to know what the loneliness of power means, Boric told him. Kast, for his part, thanked Boric for the call and invited him to a very orderly transition and asked to court his opinion starting on March 11th. Unlike the left, which was slow to take on the challenge of curbing crime and organized criminal networks that hit the poorest hardest, this was not a priority for the Boric government when it took office. The far right has centered its discourse on radical measures, such as building a mega prison in the Atacama Desert. The public, resistant to normalizing public insecurity because it was not part of everyday life in the past, has largely backed Kast, who at the same time promises tough measures against the roughly 330,000 undocumented migrants currently living in Chile, most of them Venezuelans. During the campaign, Kast has counted down the days remaining until he takes office, days which, he says, are also the time left for undocumented foreigners to leave the country. Kast will pursue what he calls an emergency government to tackle what he considers Chile's three main crises: crime, irregular migration, and low economic growth. He promises to tighten the state and cut $6.5 billion in public spending, though he has not explained how, while it remains unclear whether he will push restrictions on the individual freedoms that Chile has gained in recent decades, such as access to abortion under 3 circumstances. His main target during the campaign has been the Boric government, an administration he has labeled inept, among other criticisms. The academic Stephanie Allende argues that Kast did not emerge out of nowhere. His candidacy capitalizes on the fears and persistent discontent conventional politics have been unable to process. His victory, she explains, should not therefore be interpreted as majority support for a coherent ideological project, aligned with radical conservatism and market liberalism, nor as a nostalgic vindication of the Pinochet regime. 6 years after the social uprising, which the left mistakenly interpreted as a cry for equality and against the neoliberal model, and 4 years after Boric's election, a bet on change and on a new political generation, millions of Chileans have once again swung the pendulum and, on Sunday, voted predominantly for Kast. One of the things that this article did not elaborate on, or didn't even mention really, is that Kast is almost literally a Nazi. His parents came to Chile, not Argentina, to Chile. Most of the other ones went to Argentina. came to Chile in order to escape the collapse of the Third Reich. His father was an actual literal Nazi. His mother was an actual literal Nazi that fled justice, moved to Chile, and raised her kid, who became, of course, super thrilled about Pinochet and became now the new president of, or he will be when he's sworn in, I suppose. But he won the election, and he'll be the new president of Chile. Not too long after the Pinochet dictatorship collapsed. Of course, we know that the Pinochet dictatorship started as a military coup backed by the United States, really on behalf of the United States, to overthrow the democratically elected socialist government staffed and maintained by Salvador Allende, who was killed in office, literally in his office at the presidential palace in Chile on September 11th, I think 1973, the real 9/11, if you will. And the resulting dictatorship resulted in the mass killings of communists, of socialists, of liberals, and resulted in the now infamous and darkly popular helicopter meme, maybe, if you want to call it that, in which the Pinochet government did the equivalent of Starlight Tours and took political opponents into helicopters, flew them over the ocean, and then threw them out. I call them Starlight Tours, and not too different from the Canadian police method of picking up indigenous people, driving them out into the middle of nowhere, and then dropping them off to make them walk home with the expectation of them dying on the way. The Kast presidency is another step backwards into that direction. So the Pinochet government fell apart, and eventually, basically, the Chilean government, or the Chilean people, are like, hey, we need left-wing government. Left-wing government forms, they create a new constitution, they submit it to Congress, and Congress was like, nope, sorry, that's too left-wing, we don't want that actually, and rejected it. And that's kind of what precipitated the decline and then collapse of the left-wing movement. Or maybe not collapse, but it started the death knell of the left-wing control of the Chilean government, which they're hoping to reassert and reinvigorate with presidential hopeful Janet Jara, who unfortunately did not win. She, of course, was an actual communist. She was a working class individual who came up politically. I think she started when she was 16 in politics, and she is literally from the working class. She's a native Chilean. I want to say she's indigenous or part indigenous, and came up from the working class. She and remains part of the working class against the nobleman, European despot offspring of Kast. I find it also very interesting that a lot of the worries that are plaguing the Chilean people are not unfamiliar to Americans. And I say that because these are also not exactly real worries, right? Chile actually, despite their fears about instability, about their fears of corruption or immigration, actually ranks in South America #1 in all of those categories. So all of their neighbors have more to worry about economically, financially, etc., etc. And this is largely due to the mediocre success of the previous left-wing government. And yet, the fears are there. Like, oh, the immigration from Venezuela. Where else have we seen a bunch of people falsely hyped up in fear about immigration from Venezuela that leads to the election of a far-right leader with strong Nazi ties? So, they're just mirroring the United States. If I remember correctly, Kast's people wear MAGA hats to his rallies. His election really is an extension of the MAGA movement into South America. And the other thing to point out, of course, is that the fear about the Venezuelan immigrants is the result of U.S. imperialism in South America. The people of Venezuela would not feel compelled to leave if the United States hadn't put such strangleholds on their government, on their economy, and on their personhood. The U.S. sanctions and blockades, which are now escalating as of quite literally right now in the last 5 minutes, have been suffocating for the Venezuelan people. And that has led to many of them leaving the country to try and live a happier, healthier life outside of Venezuela's borders, because they can no longer live there due to U.S. imperialism, which again is to control the oil and to suffocate left-wing movements and popular rule in Central and South America, in which the U.S. sphere of influence, in accordance with the age-old Monroe Doctrine, plus the U.S. imperialism and imperial project in general. So, aping the United States in manner and in belief due to fears about problems directly caused by the United States is, frankly, in my opinion, comical, but it would be funnier if real people's lives weren't at stake. 330,000 Venezuelan immigrants now have, just as they do in the United States, a lot of worry about what's coming next for them and what the upcoming literal Nazi president plans to do with immigrants, especially the so-called illegal immigrants in his country. Hey guys, if you're enjoying the show, consider supporting us at solidaritytelevision.org. E.P.A. erases mention of humans causing climate change from some web pages. December 9, 2025, in the New York Times. An E.P.A. site listing the causes of climate change no longer includes the main one, human activity. The Environmental Protection Agency has quietly removed the fact that human activity is driving climate change from a handful of pages on its website. The information was deleted from one web page titled Causes of Climate Change, and another that tracks the impacts of global warming in the United States. The change comes as the Trump administration takes aggressive action to boost oil, gas, and coal, the burning of which is the main driver of global warming. Mr. Trump, who calls climate change a hoax, has eliminated climate regulations and made it easier to develop fossil fuels and harder to build renewable energy like wind and solar power. Chris Wright, the Energy Secretary, commissioned 5 climate skeptics to write a report that downplayed the seriousness of global warming. The E.P.A., under Administrator Lee Zeldin, is poised to eliminate a scientific finding that climate change threatens human health, a move that would erase the federal government's legal authority to regulate carbon dioxide and other planet-warming pollution. Bridget Hirsch, a spokeswoman for Mr. Zeldin, said the Trump administration is focused on protecting human health rather than what she called left-wing political agendas. This agency no longer takes marching orders from the climate cult, Ms. Hirsch said in a statement. She noted that the older web pages have been archived and are still available online. Daniel Swain, a climate scientist at the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources, said he recently discovered that the E.P.A. had removed from its website information on climate change indicators, trends about heat waves, rising sea levels, and other effects. It had been a rich source for educators, Mr. Swain said, adding that he frequently referred to the site's data, charts, and other information during his lectures. Then he noticed that the webpage about the causes of climate change no longer listed the primary cause, human activity. Instead, the page offers other possible causes, like changes in the sun's energy and volcanic eruptions. Previously, the page noted that since the Industrial Revolution, human activities have released large levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that change the Earth's climate. It detailed the amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide that are released into the atmosphere each year from tailpipes, smokestacks, and leaking oil and gas wells. According to data from the Wayback Machine, a digital repository, the changes appear to have been made sometime after October 8th. Scientists said other data on the causes of climate change page are accurate. For example, the page still notes that solar variations have played little role in climate changes observed in the recent decade. Elsewhere on the E.P.A. site, human causes of global warming are still noted on a page labeled Future of Climate Change. Human activity is unequivocally the leading driver of climate change. Even the Trump administration has acknowledged that scientific consensus, releasing a sweeping report in 2017 finding that the long-term warming trend is unambiguous and there is no convincing alternative explanation that anything other than humans are to blame. It's not that complicated, Andrew Dessler, a professor of atmospheric sciences at Texas A&M University. Humans are doing it. That can be the whole page. The continued belief in and propagation of the climate change hoax conspiracy is frustrating. I don't want to say it's baffling, because I understand the causes, and it's that the capitalist enterprises that pollute the world and the American imperial order, which supports and exists to benefit those capitalist enterprises in polluting the world, don't want the people to know that they are destroying their own habitat, right? No one wants to admit that they're the ones who set the bathroom curtains on fire. And so, now Donald Trump, in cahoots with these capitalist enterprises, like every president before him, of course, is denying the effects that we, and by we, of course, I mean the rapid industry, the so-called industrialists and the capitalist oligarchs that run our country and most of the Western world, are to blame. And so Trump's at their beck and call. Of course, Trump is or was one of them. And the fact that this has turned into a culture war debacle instead of a political or scientific debacle is an absolute victory for the right wing, right? The fact that there are people out there who doubt climate change, even as you can quite seriously measure the effects and oftentimes notice the effects personally, the fact that there are people out there who deny it proves that the right-wing campaign to spread disinformation, and I shouldn't even say the right-wing campaign. Capitalism is right-wing, so the capitalists, we'll include some of the liberals in this too. Their campaign to muddy the waters, to cast doubt upon the reality of climate change, has been effective. And the fact that the debate is not how do we stop climate change, it's is climate change real, is ridiculous. But it's a total success of the right and of the conservatives, of the capitalist ruling order in general. Capitalists don't want you to know that they are causing climate change. And there's a lot that we can take responsibility for as individuals. Yes. It is good to recycle. It is good to, have less pollutant cars. If your options are between a Ford F-350 or a Hummer and like a Nissan Leaf, if those are two realistic options for you, you can pick and choose what's going to be less pollutant, what's going to be, hazardous to the health of the public. But the biggest polluter on Earth is the U.S. military. And once we start to realize that these are institutional problem causers for climate change, big business, the military-industrial complex, the U.S. military at large, rapid industry, consumer products in which we, consume, or consumerism in general, the constant drive to create and then to create new waste rather than for actual, betterment of humanity, and our reliance and over-reliance on fossil fuels and the short-term profits that the fossil fuel industry generates for shareholders and owners at the expense of the working class are to blame. So whether or not, obviously recycle, but whether or not you are throwing your plastic bottle in the recycling can or in the trash can makes very little difference compared to the U.S. military, which is burning all of its waste in giant toxic pits outside of Fallujah and irradiating the city. So, because it's so dependent on these massive polluters and not reliant on individual behaviors, which of course contribute, and you should be policing your own behavior anyway. That's why they don't want you to know about climate change. If climate change was something that you personally could affect, of course they'd tell you to go and fix it. But because it's something that is a direct result of the pursuit of short-term profits, they don't want you to know, or they want you to have to question and argue whether or not climate change is real and or caused by humans. The oil industry, huge problem. The natural gas and the coal industries are also big problems, probably in lessening degrees. I don't know exactly how much coal is still used in comparison to oil and gas. I guess it's used for a lot of power plants, though. These are all industries that make immense short-term profits from selling non-renewable resources that create a ton of pollution. And thus, the constant sale of these non-renewable resources generates more and more profit. Obviously, you can only burn coal once, but you can get power from the sun every single day. So they'd want to invest and keep their investments in natural or fossil fuels because that guarantees more profits, because it guarantees more product has to be sold. And in contrast, investing in renewable resources or even in nuclear, which is not quite renewable, but it's basically, does not generate profits for these companies. And so they lobby the government and they get involved in evangelical churches and whatnot to make climate change a question of, the woke mind virus, and for it to be a question at all of its reality, instead of being a problem that we all have to get together to actually fix before it's too late. Like the curtains being lit on fire in your bathroom, that's a sucky problem, but it gets to be a huge problem if you ignore it and it sets the house on fire. Solidarity Television is an independent grassroots news organization. That means we rely exclusively on viewers like you. Support us at solidaritytelevision.org. Amtrak is slashing executive bonuses to give out $900 apiece to over 18,000 rank-and-file workers. December 12, 2025, via Fortune. More than 18,000 Amtrak workers will receive a $900 bonus before the end of the year, the U.S. Department of Transportation announced on Thursday evening. Funding for the bonus will come from Amtrak's executive leadership team bonus packages, the statement said. The federal administration urged executive leadership to forego 50% of the bonus packages that would have been paid out under the misplaced priorities of the previous executive bonus structure. Amtrak set all-time records for both ridership and revenue in the 2025 fiscal year, according to its annual report, with over $2.7 billion in ticket revenue from 34.5 million riders. The bonuses were applauded by some unions representing train workers. End-of-year bonuses will now go to 18,000 frontline workers rather than being limited to the executive ranks. This long-overdue recognition of the employees who keep the railroad moving is a step in the right direction. Mark Wallace, the president of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen National Union, said in a statement. The announcement comes amid ongoing controversy over the Trump administration's decision to limit $10,000 bonuses to air traffic controllers and technicians who had perfect attendance during the government shutdown, a measure that rewarded only 776 people and left nearly 20,000 other workers without the payment. The disparity was blasted by air traffic controller unions at the time of the announcement in November. We are concerned that thousands of air traffic controllers who consistently reported for duty during the shutdown, ensuring the safe transport of passengers and cargo across the nation, while working without pay and uncertain of when they would receive compensation, were excluded from this recognition, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association union said in a statement. I love Amtrak. I seriously do. Taking the train is one of life's great pleasures. It's by far my favorite way to travel. It's safer than the bus. It's safer than driving by a lot. It's more convenient than walking or biking, depending on how far you're going. Like I wouldn't take the train to my local grocery store, but I would to San Diego, and have. I've taken a couple cross-country trips going all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast and back on the train, on Amtrak specifically. I took trains extensively when I lived in Europe. I love it. And to see Amtrak actually going to bat for its own employees, for the working class in this regard, is also fantastic. I have never heard of a single company ever putting bonuses for its employees ahead of bonuses for its executive staff. Because, of course, every other company runs for profit, and Amtrak does too. Amtrak is required to. I'll get into that in a second. All these companies run for the benefit of the shareholders. But Amtrak, being a public service private company run by the government, probably sees more value in its laborers than it does in its executive staff, because it's supposed to be a public service. And so this is fantastic. I feel bad for the air traffic controllers. It really sucks that they got screwed like that. 770 some out of 20,000 people are getting these bonuses. But Amtrak also employs about 20,000 people, and 18,000 of them are getting $900 holiday bonuses, or end-of-year bonuses. I don't know. I'll call them holiday bonuses. End-of-year bonuses. $900 is a lot. I don't have to tell you, that's a decent chunk of change. And the fact that almost 18,000 people can get $900 and it's only 50% of the executive bonuses, kind of fishy. I don't know if these Amtrak executives deserve however much money that is. But I do know that the workers deserve it. They definitely earned that $900 bonus, all of them. So about 2,000, by my estimation, about 2,000 Amtrak employees are not going to be getting that bonus. Why? I don't know. Who that's dished out to, I don't know. Maybe they have, part-timers who work, 6 hours a week or something. I'm not entirely sure why they decided or how they decided who doesn't get the bonus. But the vast majority of their employees will be getting it. So that is absolutely fantastic. The way that Amtrak works, very simply speaking, is, I guess we have to go back to the origin of Amtrak. The United States used to have a very, very robust and extensive rail network, passenger rail network. In fact, most of the countries we associate with very robust rail networks, Japan, Germany, France, studied the United States in order to copy their rail network. Probably Great Britain is the one that didn't, because of course trains kind of come from there in the first place. So I think Germany's rail system is directly based on the state of Indiana. So if you can think about that for a second. And mass transit, passenger transit, used to be the way to travel. And I don't mean that in terms of how great it was. I mean that that was your only serious option. But downside is all of these passenger networks, as dense and as prolific as they were privatized. They were all owned by private corporations, which really didn't make money or really didn't make serious profits, if any profits, on the passenger lines, while they made massive profits on freight. So and the way that they kept all of these passenger lines running is by contracts with the United States Postal Service, running RPOs, railway post offices. And when the USPS switched from rail transit to truck and plane, because their priority was always delivering mail as fast and as conveniently as possible, and stitching cars to passenger networks was not always the fastest, especially when you could load a ton more onto an airplane and get it across the country in hours instead of 2 days. When they stopped renewing their contracts for passenger lines, a lot of these private companies realized that they weren't going to be making bank anymore, because those contracts with the post office were the way that they made their money. And so they just canceled these lines. Due to tax regulations, in every state except for New Jersey, railways paid taxes based on the amount of track laid instead of track traveled. So they would have as few tracks as possible. So if a track wasn't generating revenue, they would tear it out. Or if a passenger line had to compete with freight on one single track rather than building a second track to run them simultaneously, they'd run them both on the same track. So if the freight one was generating more revenue than the passenger one, once passenger one stopped generating revenue, they'd pull that out. So that's how we got to the situation where passenger rail rapidly collapsed. And the federal government realized something had to be done, but this was the era of growing neoliberalism, and thank God it was only in growing neoliberalism before Reagan took office, because their solution was a private corporation that was beholden to the U.S. government in order to create mass public transit. The one stipulation was, though, that they had to generate profits. Does Amtrak generate profits? They do. They've been getting better every single year. This year, as we saw in the article, they generated record profits from record ridership and record revenue. And so that's how Amtrak was founded, and that's kind of how it operates. It's an independent corporation, sort of, overseen by the federal government, sort of. One of the many benefits of Amtrak is, legally speaking, it has to take priority over private rail. That doesn't happen. The Department of Transportation has never had teeth to actually take on these rail corporations like Union Pacific, but they've started to in the future, or as we've come into the future, and we're now seeing the Department of Transportation and Amtrak start to actually care about its employees in ways that we don't see from any other corporation. So that's the very rapidly spoken and very condensed story of how we got to Amtrak. If you get the opportunity, travel on the train. It's a wonderful experience. It's not like taking a bus. It's not like flying. It's better. It's more comfortable. It's more convenient. Well, for a lot of people. I guess if you don't live near a railway station, it's not convenient. And it really is the idyllic way to travel. Imagine, especially if you're going long distances, imagine just getting onto, your own private car. I guess it's not that private. You are probably taking coach. You cannot afford the sleeper cars. I can't afford the sleeper cars. You probably can't either. But imagine getting into a passenger car, and once you're on, that time is yours. You can do whatever you want for the whole day, overnight. You can sleep. You can look out the window. You can talk to people, meet new strangers. I have a lot of stories to tell about my time on the rails and how much I loved it, which we don't have the time for. It's also not really relevant to the article. But in conclusion, Amtrak is absolutely a wonderful experience. They need a lot more funding, and we need to build a lot more rail to both drive down prices, drive up ridership, and just make the experience better overall. The more people take the train, the better it's going to be for everybody. So definitely, if you have the option between rail or plane, consider the train. Did you know the People's Report is produced for video and audio platforms? Stay informed by subscribing to us on YouTube or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Bulgarian government resigns after weeks of street protests, December 11, 2025, via Reuters. Bulgaria's government resigned on Thursday after less than a year in power, following weeks of street protests over its economic policies and its perceived failure to tackle corruption. Prime Minister Rosen Zhelezhakov announced the decision in a televised address just minutes before Parliament was due to vote on a no-confidence motion. The resignation comes less than 3 weeks before Bulgaria is due to join the Eurozone on January 1st. Our coalition met, we discussed the current situation, the challenges we face, and the decisions we must responsibly make, Zhelezhakov said, confirming that the government would step down. Thousands of Bulgarians rallied on Wednesday evening in Sofia and dozens of other towns and cities, the latest in a wave of demonstrations highlighting public anger over endemic graft and successive governments' inability to root it out. We realized that the protest was against arrogance and conceit. This is not a social protest, but a protest for values, Zhelezhakov said. It was not a meeting of political opponents over policies, but over attitudes, and therefore it unites different components of Bulgarian society. Many of the protesters are younger urban professionals who strongly support Bulgaria's ascension to the Eurozone and want it to become more part of the European mainstream. Bulgaria remains the poorest and most corrupt member of state in the European Union, which it joined in 2007. Last week, Zhelezhakov's government withdrew its 2026 budget plan, the first drafted in euros, after protests erupted over proposals to raise Social Security contributions and taxes on dividends to fund higher state spending. Despite the retreat, demonstrations continued in a country that has held 7 national elections in the past 4 years, most recently in October 2024, amid deep political divisions. This resignation is the first step towards Bulgaria becoming a normal European country, said Asen Vasilev, leader of the opposition Continue the Change Democratic Bulgaria, CCDB, the party that filed a no-confidence motion. The next step is to hold fair and free elections, not elections marred by electoral manipulation, as was the case with the last parliamentary elections, Vasilev added. President Rumen Radev will now ask the parties represented in parliament to try and form a new government. If they fail, as appears likely, he will appoint an interim administration to run the country until a new election can be held. Boriko Borisov, leader of the center-right GERB party that led the outgoing coalition, defended its record, which included ushering Bulgaria into the European Union's open-border Schengen zone and completing preparations to join the euro. We have nothing to be ashamed of over these past 11 months, Borisov told a news conference at his party's headquarters. After today, we will be a strong opposition. We will work to win the next elections. I have to wonder first how Bulgarians feel about being described as the poorest and most corrupt country in the European Union. Poorest might be a lot more easy to quantify, but I wonder if Bulgarians on average would agree with that or if they would take offense. Not described as such by name in the article, but in many other articles about the Bulgarian protests have described them as part of the Gen Z protests, which of course we know is kind of a misnomer. A lot of the participants in these protests are not Gen Z, and it's my speculation that they continue to use the term Gen Z protest in order to delegitimize the protests and the goals of these demonstrations, because they are overwhelmingly working class protests. When we saw them in South America, overwhelmingly, these people were not young people. They were people of all ages, all of whom were working class individuals. But, calling these protests working class protests has a sort of, offers a fear factor to the bourgeois elites who kind of control the news media and who run the United States and the West at large. Because the idea of the working class being unified behind something and describing it as such breaks down the fake, maybe not fake, but it breaks down the barriers that separate the working class along artificially inflated, I'll say, lines that we call the culture war. If people start fighting the class war instead of the culture war, well then the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, is at risk. Because again, the only thing that the ruling class fears is the working class, because the working class is the only one who have the power to destroy them. And of course, we in the working class outnumber them like 1,000,000 to 1. And if we ever figure that out, that's their, as they say in A Bug's Life, their way of life is over. So that's why they don't really call these, that's why they call these Gen Z protests. I think also that for a lot of people, the Gen Z moniker adds either, and maybe sometimes both, a flair of youthfulness to it, while also adding a flair of silliness. Like, it's those kids acting up instead of, and for some people that might be cool. So for others, it's not exciting. But it's to break away from the idea that maybe you, older, if you're older than Gen Z, might otherwise participate or might otherwise drive it. Now, we're never going to see something like that here in the United States, not for a very, very long time. Any youth movement, of course, we know gets crushed violently. The youth movement on the college campuses by pro-Palestinian students was crushed violently by the Biden administration, who not just allowed and endorsed the violent repercussions from law enforcement, but also tacitly allowed local gangs to attack students. And of course, those protests did not influence U.S. politics whatsoever, aside from the fact that a lot of these students who were brutalized did not turn out to vote for the Democrats in 2024, and their neglect of the student and of the general working class demands across the United States resulted in the Trump administration, which has done nothing different from the Biden administration. So So our police state, of course, is way too violent, way too aggressive to allow this. And Bulgaria's historically has been a little bit more resistant to pressure also. The last couple protests in 2013 and I think 2021 lasted for months. For time scale, the protests that toppled the Bulgarian government started on November 2026. So as of the date of this article, let me take a quick look here, just to give the days, December 11th. So from November 26th to December 11th is all it took for the government to completely dissolve. Unfortunately, other articles are saying that we can't really expect to see much change in Bulgaria. Much of how this works is because they've had 7 governmental elections in the last 4 years. Largely how it works is people say, hey, this is bullshit, knock it off. The government collapses, and then they reform, but it's all the same people. So, or the same parties. So they need to have something a bit more thorough than angry parades. But who knows, we got to remain optimistic. If it can work in Bulgaria, maybe it'll work elsewhere. It seems to be working so far in Nepal. We'll see how things turn out in Peru and Madagascar, etc. So, best of luck to the Bulgarians. Hopefully the transition into more European Union style country will work, switching to the Euro, the Schengen zone. I don't have a lot of comment on whether or not that's good or bad. I don't live in Europe. When I did, I lived within the Schengen zone. It was really nice to have those open borders. For those of you who don't know, the Schengen zone allows open borders between countries within that agreement. So it's kind of like the way the United States operates, where when you fly into, say, California, you get checked by Border Patrol in California when you arrive, and then you can go anywhere in the United States, and then when you leave, say, out of Alabama, they check you then, rather than checking you at every border. So that's kind of how the Schengen zone works. You fly into, in this case, you'll fly into Bulgaria, they'll vet you, and then you can go anywhere within the Schengen zone, fly out of Paris if you want, and then they'll vet you on your way out. So that's one of the big benefits of that. The Euro, I can't comment on whether or not switching to the Euro is good. I honestly don't know. Britain didn't seem to like it, and a bunch of the other countries in Europe haven't, but some have, so to varying degrees of success. So good luck to Bulgaria with their working class protests. Hope you guys are able to create a government that works for the working class of Bulgaria and not for the mafia or the ruling class in Bulgaria. Best of luck to you guys. If you like the People's Report, check out our other shows at solidaritytv.org. The UK wants to emulate Denmark's hardline asylum model, but what does it actually look like? November 14th, 2025 via The Guardian. Denmark has dramatically reduced asylum numbers by shifting from permanent settlement to short-term renewable refugee permits, creating long-term uncertainty and acting as a strong deterrent to asylum seekers. Since the 2015 refugee crisis, refugees receive 1 to 2 year temporary permits with no automatic path to permanence, and must meet strict language and long-term employment requirements to qualify for permanent residency. These policies have sharply lowered asylum arrivals from nearly 15,000 in 2014 to around 2,300 per year by 2024, with only 1% of resident permits now going to refugees. The approach has attracted international criticism from the UN and human rights groups, with critics arguing it undermines integration, damages Denmark's humanitarian values, and treats refugees as temporary visitors. Denmark's center-left government under Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has embraced hardline migration policies traditionally associated with the right, framing deterrence and repatriation as central goals. While some integration measures are seen as effective, critics warn Denmark faces a growing contradiction. Discouraging refugees while an aging population and labor shortages increase the need for migration. It frankly comes at no surprise to me that the UK would want to copy these draconian anti-immigration rules from Denmark. The only thing that comes at a surprise to me is that these rules are from Denmark. I would have maybe expected the other way around. But Among the laws that Denmark has in place, one of them is so-called anti-ghetto laws that allows the government to bulldoze neighborhoods that have less than half of the population is native. Let me read that specifically out loud to you guys so you understand what exactly this means. I should have had it pulled up already. Here we go. The Parallel Societies Law is what it's technically called. It allows the state to demolish apartment blocks in areas where at least half of the residents have a non-Western background. So this is just straight up racist. Extremely so. Because, of course, they get to pick and choose what is and isn't Western. And the idea that, oh, well, Westerners are acceptable, but non-Westerners aren't. They get to have their homes bulldozed, is some Israeli shit. But, of course, this, like the Israeli government, are just aspects of both the U.S. the U.S. imperial order, and in general, the capitalist regime that is supported by and in turn supports white supremacy. On a similar note, the migrants and the refugees that they do allow, most of them are Ukrainian now. Everyone else gets pretty much turned away. So they're picking and choosing what refugees get to go in. If you're from a war-torn country that's white, great. If you're from a war-torn country that's brown, go home. That's how these guys operate. That's how Europe operates. That's how the United States operates. The United States is a little bit, used to be a little bit less transparent about it. I wouldn't even say that. American liberals were more blind to it in the past. Senior advisor to the European Union's top court found that the law, the ghetto law, constitutes direct discrimination on the basis of ethnic origin, which is obvious. What is and isn't Western? Is Ukraine Western? What about Turkey? Is Turkey Western? I would argue perhaps. What about Japan? Is Japan Western? Or the south of Korea, is that Western? But, they get to pick and choose. Half of the Middle East was part of the Western world for a very long time. Do we consider Syria to be Western? I mean, we all know the answer to that. No. Denmark is not going to consider Syria to be Western. Why? Is because they don't want, non-whites in the country, if they can get away with it. But one of the things that really stood out to me in this article, and hopefully you understand why this was so appalling, in the section where it's describing the specific number, so I'll read that out to you. 2014, 14,792 asylum seekers were in Denmark. By 2024, it's 2,333. So, significant reduction. This reduction has come at a cost, critics say, to Denmark's reputation and sense of self. Note, the article does not consider the cost to non-Danish people living in the country to be legitimate. The cost of the lack of opportunity for refugees fleeing war to have someplace safe to live. That's not a cost. And the inherent framing of, getting rid of immigrants, getting rid of asylum seekers and refugees, which I guess technically could be good if we mean reducing the causes of asylum and the necessity for people to become refugees. Necessity of people to become refugees? I don't know, you know what I mean. It'd be a good thing if that's what it is. Obviously, they mean getting rid of these people in general, or just not letting them in. That is inherently framed in the article as a good thing. And the bad thing about it is, in reducing these, is that it's like, we're achieving this good thing by reducing the amount of foreigners entering the country. The problem with reducing the amount of foreigners in the country is that we look bad. So, just the inherent media framing of immigrants, of asylum seekers, of refugees, as being inherently anti-Danish, as being a threat to the world, is so unbelievably fascist that it's appalling. When I read that, I was genuinely appalled that it would be framed like so. Again, I can't express surprise. This is the stuff I hear every single day from most media broadcasters anyway. It's why we do what we do. So, it's no surprise that the UK wants to copy this. They've already had anti-Muslim pogroms throughout the country, as recently as last year, trying to mass murder asylum seekers by burning down hotels in which they were residing in. And we saw this extend to the north of Ireland, in Belfast, all the way, and then all through the United Kingdom. We've seen the UK lose a World Cup match and immediately start chucking random black people into the river because there's a black man who missed one of the penalty kicks. And, deeply racist country, deeply anti-immigrant country. Ironic for the UK, whose core value is plundering, robbing, and illegal immigration. Invasion, literal invasion, as opposed to the so-called invasion that they have from minorities who live there. That's, their legacy. So, it's of no surprise that they want to extend these draconian, violent, and overtly hateful rules to prevent the country from slipping out of the clutches of white supremacy. This week's book recommendation is Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. It discusses the history of fascism and its inevitability in a capitalist world. Illinois becomes 12th state to provide medically assisted suicide for the terminally ill. December 12, 2025, via AP News. Legalized medically assisted suicide takes effect in September 2026 to give the Illinois Department of Public Health and other medical participants time to develop stringent protections and processes for implementing the provision, according to the Democratic Governor's Office. It's also known as Deb's Law, honoring Deb Robertson, a lifetime resident of the state living with a rare terminal illness who has pushed for the measure's approval and testified to the suffering of people and their families waiting for the chance to decide for themselves how and when their lives should end. Pritzker said he has been moved by stories of patients suffering from terminal illness and their devotion to freedom and choice at the end of life in the midst of personal heartbreak. This legislation will be thoughtfully implemented so that physicians can consult patients on making deeply personal decisions with authority, autonomy, and empathy, Pritzker said after signing the measure in Chicago. 11 other states and the District of Columbia allow medically assisted suicide, according to the advocacy group Death with Dignity. Delaware was the latest, and its provision takes effect January 1, 2026. 7 other states are considering allowing it. In Illinois, patients 18 and older with physician-confirmed mental capacity to make medical decisions may request end-of-life medication if they have an illness that could be fatal within 6 months, as verified by 2 doctors, as well as have received information about all end-of-life care options, such as hospice or palliative care. Additionally, both oral and written requests for the medication must come from the patient, not a surrogate or a proxy. Sponsoring Senator Linda Holmes, a suburban Chicago Democrat, said both her parents died of cancer. I'll never forget the helplessness feeling watching them suffer when there's nothing I could do to help them, Holmes said. Every adult patient of sound mind should have this as one more option in their end-of-life care in the event their suffering becomes unbearable. The Illinois House approved the measure 63-42 in late May at the end of the legislative spring session. The Senate didn't take it up until October when it was approved 30-27. In both chambers, there were prominent Democratic no votes. The Catholic Conference of Illinois, representing the state's 6 Catholic dioceses, issued a statement disparaging Pritzker's action, saying the law puts Illinois at a dangerous and heartbreaking path. Rather than investing in real end-of-life support such as palliative and hospice care, pain management, and family-centered accompaniment, our state has chosen to normalize killing oneself, the Catholic bishop said. This law ignores the very real failures in access to quality care that drive vulnerable people to despair. The conference also derided the idea that Illinois has legalized suicide for some while attempting to prevent it in others, particularly teenagers, among whom suicide is the second leading cause of death. That sentiment was echoed by the nonpartisan advocacy and lobbyist group Patients' Rights Action Fund. Assisted suicide plunges Illinoisans with disabilities and other vulnerable people into conversations about death, instead of the care and support they deserve from their medical teams, said Matt Valieri, the group's president and CEO. Deb Robertson, the retired social worker from suburban Chicago who gave a name for the law, thanked Pritzker for signing the law providing the full range of end-of-life options. Robertson added, "The end for me could be near, but I'm pleased to have been able to play some role in ensuring that terminally ill Illinois residents have access to medical aid in dying." Don't often gotta hand it to the Catholics, but in all honesty, I think I agree with a lot of what they've said. Specifically, this law ignores the very real failures in access to quality care that drive vulnerable people to despair. I think that that's right. Rather than investing in real end-of-life support, our state has chosen to normalize killing oneself. The fact is, under the capitalist system and under our so-called healthcare system, we do not prioritize health, and we don't prioritize taking care of the sick. What we prioritize is short-term profits for medical corporations and for health insurers and for private health facilities rather than the health of the public. And one of the things that we've been seeing in some of these places with assisted suicide, and I think Canada is one of these as well, is that people who have illnesses that they can't afford to treat feel compelled to participate in these suicidal behaviors. Medically assisted suicide then becomes a way to avoid saddling your family with, or yourself, with massive medical debt, rather than as a way to have dignity in your last moments. Now, am I wholly opposed to medically assisted suicide? Not necessarily. I do think that having it as an easy option, I don't want to say it's slippery slope or whatever. I think that there's a lot that has to be going into it. And I appreciate that Illinois has decided that they're going to enact it like a year from now in order to spend a lot of time hammering out the details so they can prevent people from being pressured into using it, and to make sure that people who are doing so with dignity, rather than out of fear. I like some of what they have so far. You have to be diagnosed with something that will kill you in 6 months or less. I think that that's probably better than some of these other places that just have fatality or are going to be a long-term problem. You have to get it checked and double checked by 2 different doctors. You have to have a request in writing and in speech. Although I wonder for people who maybe can't write or people who have speech problems, I have to imagine that they'll figure that out, though. It seems like an obvious problem. And that kind of thing. I think that they have really thought this out and want to make it possible for people who are suffering to have dignity. Because, like the woman in the article says, it is, or I have to imagine it is, incredibly painful to watch someone suffer for a very long time, or to suffer for a very long time, and then not have control even over your own death, and have that entirely up to when your body eventually stops working. Maybe you can't eat anymore, or you can't take in water. I think it's one of the things that rabies can give you. And you just slowly die in a very painful and unpleasant manner that can't be avoided. And sometimes we see these people in these situations opt for a non-medically assisted suicide, and it's very painful for the family, and sometimes very difficult to clean up, which is traumatic in its own right. So I'm not going to say, oh, medically assisted suicide is bad and we can't have it. But I am very, very critical of its push in the United States. And in any country any capitalist country, but in any country with for-profit medicine. In some of these other states, are people always going to think it through? Are people going to be as thoughtful about it as Illinois seems to be at the moment? What other options are there? And as the Catholic Church says, is this a time and money investment into assisting in the death of people when that time and money could be invested in assisting in the life of people? It's also nice to see, I guess, the pro-life crowd actually, I don't know, maybe this isn't any different from them being normally pro-life. Yeah, anyway, I forgot I said that, I guess. But I think that they are, looking at this with the correct thought, because we don't take care of people. We don't take care of people in the end-of-life care. Are there going to be sick people who are lonely and they're just going to get the write-off? Are there going to be hospitals that realize that when this person dies, no one's going to pay the medical bills, and so they're going to encourage, suggest, or enable assisted suicide in order to save the hospital money or the assisted living facility money, that kind of thing? I don't know. Hopefully not. I know that has happened. Hopefully there are going to be rules in place to prevent that from happening. So, it's a difficult situation. I don't want to have any knee-jerk reactions. Again, I'll reiterate, I like that Illinois seems to have put a lot of serious thought into this and want to make sure that it's only being used by people who have a need for it. But I also have to say that we don't care about people in this country. We don't care about their lives, and we don't care about their deaths. And we need to do something more to enable people to live healthy, fulfilling lives that give them dignity in life rather than just reducing them to having dignity in death. Hey guys, remember the words of Chairman Mao: civilize the mind and make savage the body. If it makes sense for you, this week let's all take our walk to the next level and get some good aerobic exercise with a healthy run. Danish intelligence accuses U.S. of using economic power to assert its will over allies. December 12, 2025, via The Guardian. Danish intelligence services have accused the U.S. of using its economic power to assert its will and threatening military force against its allies. The comments made in its annual assessment released this week mark the first time that the Danish Defense Intelligence Service, the DDIS, has listed the U.S. as a threat to the country. Denmark, the report warns, is facing more and more serious threats and security policy challenges than in many years. The report said that the U.S. is now using its economic and technological strength as a means of power, including against allies and partners. Competition between superpowers Russia, China, and the U.S., it said, is increasingly taking place in the Arctic, which is growing in strategic importance amid increasing tensions between Russia and the West. This, it notes, poses a specific threat to Denmark, which used to rule Greenland as a colony and continues to control its foreign and security policy. The increased great power competition in the Arctic has significantly increased international attention to the region, it said. This applies in particular to the United States' increasing interest in Greenland and its importance to U.S. national security. It adds, at the same time, the attention increases the threat from espionage, including cyber espionage, and attempts to further influence all parts of the Kingdom of Denmark. Greenland remains part of the Danish Commonwealth or Kingdom. Last week, the new U.S. National Security Strategy Policy document, with an introduction signed by Trump, claimed that Europe faces civilizational erasure within the next 2 decades as a result of migration and EU integration, arguing that the U.S. must cultivate resistance within the continent to Europe's current trajectory. It came at a time of already heightened tension between the U.S. and Denmark after Trump's repeated assertions over the past year that he wants to take control of Greenland. Earlier this year, Vice President J.D. Vance visited U.S. military base Spouting and accused Denmark of having not done a good job in Greenland. In August, an alleged U.S. influence campaign in Greenland resulted in Denmark summoning the U.S. charged affairs. and a damning symbol of the changed dynamics between Denmark and the US, traditionally its largest and most important ally. It was recently revealed that Copenhagen had established a night watch, tasked with monitoring Trump's unpredictable words and actions while Denmark sleeps. Despite the report's warnings, ahead of the DDIS, Thomas and Rankel said that the US was still Denmark's closest ally. The United States has been and continues to be the guarantor of Europe's security through its involvement in the transatlantic alliance, its presence in Europe, and through the American nuclear umbrella, he told broadcaster DR. The United States is leveraging economic power, including threats of high tariffs, to assert its will, and the possibility of employing military force, even against its allies, is no longer ruled out, the report said. It also warns of the uncertainty around the role of the U.S. as a guarantor of European security, which it said will increase Russia's willingness to intensify its hybrid attacks against NATO. It adds, the military threat from Russia to NATO will increase, even though there is currently no threat of a regular military attack against the Kingdom of Denmark. A lot to cover in this one. Honestly, I almost don't feel bad for, after reading the article about Denmark and their horrible anti-immigration laws, I almost don't feel bad for them that they're, at odds with the United States. Just saying that first. But some of the claims in this article are ridiculous. I mean, let's start with what Trump is saying about Europe. The U.S. national security strategy, saying that Europe faces civilizational erasure within the next 2 decades as a result of migration and EU integration, arguing that the U.S. must cultivate resistance within the continent to Europe's current trajectory. That is absurd. If in 20 years Europe and European civilization is going to disappear, are we kidding? Who believes that? Well, we all know who believes that. But it's so absurd to hear anybody say it, let alone anybody with actual meaningful power. Because of course the United States has a military occupation of half of Europe. And that's one of the things that they later say is that Denmark, are worried about what this means for NATO. But the idea that immigration is going to end European civilization is, this is just the barbaric hordes argument all over again. This is basic Nazi shit. That we're being invaded and we're going to be great replacement theory and all of that bullshit. I don't even know how to put into words how not just abhorrent this claim is, but how unreal it is, how fictional this belief is. 20 years, Europe is going to be gone. First of all, we could only be so lucky. But how are there going to be so many immigrants into Europe in the next 20 years that the entire Western civilization is going to be gone? And what does it even mean that the United States must cultivate resistance? We know what that means. The spread and empowerment of white supremacy and white nationalism and anti-immigrant rhetoric. Rebirth of ethno-nationalism throughout Europe, violence against minorities, and of course the thing is all of this big migration crisis stuff started, at least to my memory, with the Syrian refugee crisis, which of course was the result of U.S. imperialism, and not just the U.S. attacks on Syria, but also the United States creation of ISIS through its invasion of Iraq. So, these refugee crises and these immigrant crises that they call them, they only happen because of imperialism and meddling in foreign affairs for these short-term profits. And, of course, the idea that we're civilizationally at odds with Syrians or Venezuelans or anybody else that we're going to complain about having as immigrants is just bullshit. We have, there are different cultural elements, different religious elements, different social elements, but we're all united by class, first and foremost. I'll always have more in common with a random Syrian working class man or woman or any other Syrian individual than I will with any American bourgeois. Now, I will always have less in common with my white American landlord than I will with any working class individual from anywhere in the world. I don't care that, a Syrian immigrant and I might eat different foods. First of all, we don't, because Syrian food is great. But, we have different foods. We speak a different language. Maybe we have a different religion. We have different customs, different skin tones, different hair texture. All of this is ephemeral. It doesn't mean anything. It's pointless. But what we have in common is to varying degrees, but we have it in common, the oppression of empire and the oppression of imperialism and the oppression of capitalism. And yes, the Syrian refugee is oppressed significantly more than I am. That's why they're a refugee. But I'll always have more in common with them because the class war is the war that matters, not the culture war, not the religious war, not the immigrant war. I don't know, whatever they want to call it. So, the cultivation of resistance is the cultivation of, because again, cultivation of resistance against, the civilizational erasure Europe faces, is the cultivation of neo-Nazism, or of regular Nazism, the cultivation of fascism, white supremacy, and militant racism. That's what it is. So that's the U.S. national security strategy, is create racism in Europe. The other thing to mention here is the absurdity of this, that the United States is the guarantor of Europe's security through its involvement in the transatlantic alliance, its presence in Europe, and through the American nuclear umbrella. When have American nukes kept anybody safe? Who has been made more secure by the U.S. nuclear program? Anybody? The only people who have been kept safe by nuclear programs is people made safe by the Soviet nuclear program, made possible, allegedly, by the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs, of course, heroes of the working class, heroes of the world. They literally saved the world from nuclear Armageddon by, again, allegedly, empowering the Soviet Union to develop nuclear weapons. The Koreans were made safe by the Soviet nuclear program. The Chinese were made safe by the Soviet nuclear program. The only people who have been made safe by the American nuclear program is the billionaires and the big bankers and the bourgeois at large, who benefit from America's imperial power over the world. And thus the world has been made less safe by the collapse of the Soviet Union. Thank God China has nuclear weapons now too. Speaking of when China was developing nuclear weapons, we lost nuclear fuel in the Himalayas, and it may eventually one day pollute and poison the Ganges. Look it up. So, the guarantor of European security from the United States, from our nuclear presence, from our presence in Europe. Who do we keep safe in Europe through U.S. military occupation? Our U.S. military bases, who have they kept safe? Because they don't exist. And the United States military does not exist to keep people safe. What it guarantees is, much like the police in your neighborhood, it guarantees the safety and security of the ruling class to ensure its control of capital and its control of the working class. That's what the U.S. military does. That's what it is for. And it kills anybody who gets in its way. So why are there military bases in the UK? Not to keep the UK safe, but rather to maintain U.S. hegemony over the UK. That's why there aren't any in France, because France, for all of its problems, knows a little bit better. That's what these U.S. military bases are for. And its involvement in the transatlantic alliance and in NATO, NATO does not keep anybody safe. NATO is the, again, Nazi-American terror organization that exists exclusively to maintain U.S. imperial occupation and hegemony around the world. Did NATO keep Libyans safe? Did NATO keep Syrians safe? Did NATO keep Iraqis safe? Did NATO keep even Bosniaks safe? No. So, the idea that the U.S. breaking ties with the U.S. and Europe and Denmark, encourages Russia to be more militaristic, is absurd. Even the article says that there's no threat of a military attack against Denmark, which is a kingdom, by the way. Absurd, but whatever. That's a different criticism for another time. NATO exists to empower the U.S. military empire, and specifically in Europe against Russia, which acts as not a counterbalance, but an oppositional force to NATO. So the idea that, well, NATO keeps us safe from Russia is absurd. NATO only exists to oppress Russia and to occupy the rest of Europe and to control it. Again, different conversation which we have had before. So this whole article is, or this whole situation, because I'm not going to criticize the article, the whole situation is so intensely absurd. And I'm glad that it's coming into the national and international conversation. Kind of ridiculous that the United States wants to annex Greenland. Pretty much everything about the Trump administration is ridiculous. It's all of the flaws and failures of neoliberalism and capitalism and imperialism that we see under the Democrats turned up past 11 into just straight absurdity. But, in conclusion, I don't see how Denmark can keep considering the United States its greatest ally. My best friend would never stab me in the back like that or try to steal my garage. So, of course, my best friend would also not militarily occupy my house or put me under threat of nuclear war in order to get rich. So, I don't know. Don't be allied with the United States. Not to give props to Henry Kissinger, but he was correct when he said that it's dangerous to be America's ally, but fatal to be America's friend. Is U.S. testing the waters with reported seizure of Chinese cargo bound for Iran? December 16, 2025, via SCMP. An American Special Operations team boarded a ship from China bound for Iran in the Indian Ocean near Sri Lanka last month, the Wall Street Journal reported last Friday. Citing sources, it said the operation aimed to block Tehran's import of components for its military buildup. Operatives from the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, both special and conventional forces, allowed the vessel to proceed after confiscating the cargo, the report said. The operation comes amid Pentagon efforts to curb Iran's military buildup, including its nuclear and missile programs, following U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on Iranian facilities in June. According to the Journal report, Washington had been tracking the shipment, which included components with applications for both civilian and military use, and potentially useful for Tehran's conventional weapons development and missile programs. In April, the U.S. Treasury Department imposed sanctions on 6 entities and 6 individuals based in Iran and China for helping Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a paramilitary organization, to procure chemical ingredients used to produce solid propellant rocket motors for ballistic missiles. China has repeatedly voiced opposition to such U.S. sanctions, arguing that they hinder normal cooperation and have no basis in international law. The reported operation last month appeared to echo previous U.S. actions targeting Washington's adversaries, including Iran, North Korea, and, more recently, Venezuela. In January 2024, U.S. Central Command forces operating in the Middle East seized 200 packages containing Iranian-made components that Washington said were used to produce weapons such as medium-range ballistic missiles. The shipment, seized in the Arabian Sea off Somalia, was destined for Houthi militants in Yemen to fuel their attacks on Red Sea shipping, Central Command said. In 2020, Washington seized 4 oil tankers transporting Iranian fuel to Venezuela, in what it said was the largest seizure ever made at that time. A similar operation was also conducted during the Biden administration in 2023 when the U.S. Navy intercepted an Iranian-flagged tanker and seized its cargo of nearly 1 million barrels of sanctioned Iranian oil bound for China. In 2018, Washington seized the North Korean bulk carrier Wise Honest for sanctions violations involving coal and machinery. Dennis Wilder, a professor at Georgetown University and a former CIA official, noted that while intervention against a ship bound for Iran from China for proliferation concerns was not uncommon, it is also not unprecedented. The degree to which it deters Chinese companies from supplying Iran with WMDs or assistance for WMDs depends on the quality of the intelligence acquired, Wilder said. If intelligence is only episodic, it will not deter the proliferators. Fu Qinshao, a former Chinese Air Force colonel, described the U.S. move as unlawful. If you intercept another country's vessels on the high seas, that is, by definition, an act of piracy. Smaller countries may be forced to tolerate it, but that does not make it lawful, he said. We're now seeing U.S. carrier strike groups in the waters off South America, intercepting numerous vessels and even sinking several of them. These are outright acts of piracy that violate international law. A country cannot elevate its domestic law above international law. International law must prevail. A quick aside about something that's come out of Iran in the last 2 weeks. The Ayatollah of Iran correctly criticized the United States and the Western world at large for the gender pay gap, criticizing capitalists for not valuing women as highly as they value men and for paying them less. Just an interesting tidbit about the country of Iran. He also went on to praise the successes in science and in all manners of academic pursuits by Iranian women, and proudly boasted that that women's participation in science and in greater academic achievement in Iran has never been higher. So, just a fun fact about Iran for you, and the Ayatollah, and bust down some of the propaganda that we see about them. But China is absolutely right. What the United States is doing is piracy. It really cannot be called anything else. The seizure of foreign ships in order to steal stuff off them so that way rival countries can't have access to whatever it is, I guess maybe, if we want to get technical, privateering instead of piracy, right? Because it's at the behest of an actual government. But the U.S. State Department published a video of I believe they were Navy SEALs, attacking the boat. And I have to imagine that they did it in response to Yemen's now famous video of the Yemeni armed forces taking out the Galaxy Leader ship and seizing that early after October 7th. The SEALs were not nearly as dynamic or as visually exciting to watch as the Yemenis. Full offense to Navy SEALs, you guys blow. And you're not even interesting to watch on TV. Come on, guys. It's the one thing the U.S. military has going for it, is that they're supposed to look good, and they don't. And Yemen can look good and be morally right. So, props to you, Yemen. But it really is just piracy. And it's predicated on an entirely false belief that Iran supplies Yemen with arms. They don't. Yemen builds all of its military material at home. Now, maybe they get some parts from Iran that they can then use to develop. I don't know. But their weapons program, their ballistic missile program, their international continental ballistic missile program is entirely home source. They build them all themselves. They don't get anything from Iran. And the U.S. State Department has known this for a long time. What they want to do is they want to cripple Iran, because Iran is the biggest threat to Western hegemony across the Middle East and the control of the natural resources there, especially oil and labor. Plus, Iran is the most powerful, perhaps not the most active, but the most powerful force on the side of the Palestinian people to prevent their genocide and hopefully one day to achieve their liberation. And thus, Iran is an existential threat to the U.S. garrison known as Israel, and thus the United States is going to do whatever it can to protect its little colony in the Middle East that it uses to base nuclear weapons there to point at the rest of the Middle Eastern world in order to, again, control it and operate it on behalf of the U.S. empire. But the piracy doesn't just stop in the Indian Ocean. It extends to the Caribbean. So the U.S. has new pirates of the Caribbean with significantly less fondness from the general public, stealing Venezuelan tankers and trying to keep oil from getting to Cuba and such. It's another way to strangle Cuba and, generally speaking, self-reliance in Latin America. I do appreciate that this article correctly points out that this is not something that's unique to Trump. This has been going on under the Biden administration as well. International piracy through the U.S. Navy. So, they're just trying to prevent their rivals from being able to succeed in direct opposition to international law. Now, the one thing I will criticize the Chinese gentleman speaking here is that international law isn't real. Obviously, of course, he's going to cite it. I would too. But international law, we know, isn't real. And it exists only to punish opponents of the U.S. empire, not to protect the people of the world from other distasteful entities. So, piracy is against international law, but no one's going to enforce it. The main enforcer of anti-piracy has been the United States, so obviously they're not going to enforce anti-piracy against themselves when they're the biggest plunderers of the world at the moment. So, but, wanting to isolate Iran or Venezuela or Cuba or China from its allies, the seizure of a ship from the north of Korea as well a few years back is just one of the many imperial tactics that the U.S. uses to maintain its control and to punish rivals without having to go directly to war. In order to get these ships, people would have to fight the U.S. Navy, which is a tall order for most countries, even a lot of countries combined, of course. The obvious exception being Yemen, which has won against the U.S. Navy a few times now, most recently with expelling them from the Red Sea. So, that's what's going on. That's the real story of what's going on, is the U.S. maintaining its hegemony through piracy, heists on the high seas that are boring. And not that entertainment is the purpose or of interest in these. Like, Yemen didn't seize a Galaxy leader for my viewing pleasure. I'm glad they recorded it. I did get viewing pleasure from it. But of course, it's in accordance with their internationally mandated order to prevent and genocide by any means they have at their disposal. So, good job, Yemen. Yemen, make us proud. Turn another ship around. And the United States needs to stop piracy and stop its, going to ask the United States to stop being the global hegemon and violent imperialists all over the globe. Tall order. Hey guys, it'd mean a lot if you join our Patreon at solidaritytelevision.org. Israel propagandists are uniformly spouting the exact same line about the Bondi shooting, December 16, 2025, via Caitlin Johnston. Looks like some kind of memo went out or something, because pro-Israel outlets and individuals are all loudly amplifying one specific talking point about the Bondi Beach shooting. Here are some examples. Bondi Beach is what globalized the Intifada looks like, Bret Stephens, The New York Times. The Intifada comes to Bondi Beach, David Frum, The Atlantic. The Intifada comes to Australia, Walter Russell Mead, Wall Street Journal. Shooting at Bondi Beach is what a globalized Intifada looks like, Herb Keenan, Jerusalem Post. The Intifada comes to Australia, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, The Free Press. Welcome to the Global Intifada, David Haransi, Washington Examiner. Palestinian propaganda has globalized the Intifada, Zachary Faria, Washington Examiner. Bondi Beach massacre is what globalizing the Intifada looks like, Vivian Barakove, National Post. Chanting globalize the Intifada leads to Bondi Beach, Danny Cohen, The Telegraph. This is what happens when you globalize the Intifada, Newsweek editors. This was not an isolated act of violence. It is a culmination of globalize the Intifada rhetoric that has been building around the world since October 7th. Yoni Bashan, The Times. Of course, these outlets and individuals do not actually care about the phrase globalize the Intifada. If pro-Palestine activists had never chanted that slogan, pro-Israel spinmeisters would still be focusing on a different line today. They are not trying to stop chants which they perceive as dangerous. They are trying to stomp out criticism of Israel's genocidal atrocities. As The Intercept's Natasha Leonard wrote regarding the aforementioned Bret Stephens piece, it's all done in the name of fighting anti-Semitism by conflating the worst kinds of violent anti-Jewish bigotry, like we saw in Bondi Beach, with any criticisms of Israel and its actions. to so much as say Palestinians ought to have basic human rights, in this view, becomes a deadly attack on Jewish safety. The term intifada means to shake off and rise up, and as Middle East Eye's Craig Burkhead-Morton and Yasmin Zenaib Bergman explained last year, intifadas have historically included nonviolent resistance. Saying globalize the intifada isn't calling for people to massacre Jewish civilians around the world. It's advocating resistance to the power structure which incinerated Gaza and continues to inflict abuse upon Palestinians and any other population which doesn't bow to the interests of the empire. And the people scaremongering about the phrase know this. They're fully aware that they're using a tragic mass shooting as a political cudgel against people who believe Palestinians are human beings. This is just one more cynical manipulation aimed at protecting Israel from criticism, so that it can inflict more violence and suffering upon the world. As M. Hilton wrote for the Israeli outlet 972, it is obscene how quickly the right has seized on this horror to advance an Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian agenda. And it is disgusting to see Israel's politicians almost gleeful at the opportunity to distract from their genocidal onslaught in Gaza by using our pain and grief as a political weapon. How much more is there really to say about the proliferation of Zionism and, of course, the prostitution of tragedy to preserve the U.S. empire? Because, of course, the thing that Israel loves the most is finding out that Jewish people have been hurt, because they get to prostitute their bodies for the benefit of the nation-state of Israel, which of course is a branch of the U.S. military. So it's a little surprise that they would, and immediately as soon as this happened, started prostituting and I use that word very deliberately, prostituting the victims of this shooting. All in order to promote the state of Israel, because what they want overwhelmingly is they want Jewish people outside of Israel to be afraid, so they feel that their only safe place to live is Israel. And that is how they promote the state of Israel to the Jewish community, the international Jewish communities, I should say, because a lot of these communities are very different from each other. And they will never pass up a chance to do so. What is interesting about this, however, is that by Israeli standards, there's nothing wrong with the mass shooting at Bondi Beach, because the person who was one of the people who were killed was a Chabad rabbi who's a massive Israeli spokesperson. His job, and the job of Chabad, the organization that set up this event that got shot up, their job is to promote Zionism around the world and ultra-Orthodox Judaism. I got an advertisement for a colony that they're setting up in Vietnam for some reason. And that's what this event was for. It was overtly to support the state of Israel by a militantly Zionist organization run by a guy who works for the IDF. And so, by Israeli standards, him being killed and then other people being killed as byproducts of his murder, assassination, whatever you want to call it, is totally acceptable. Israel mass murders people all the time. And they always justify it as, well, human shields or collateral damage or Palestinian rats who didn't deserve to live anyway. And, of course, we're not going to make the same commentary on innocent people at the beach, even if they were associating with a genocidal organization such as Chabad. But it's worth pointing out that by Israeli standards, this was a totally acceptable behavior. Mass murdering people just to kill one or two people of military value. But of course, as soon as this happens, they start turning the gears and start crushing Palestinian resistance, or attempting to, labeling every single act of violence as being inherently anti-Israel and thus pro-Palestinian, because, of course, in the Israeli mind, Palestine and Israel are a dichotomy in which anything that hurts Israel benefits Palestine, and anything that hurts Palestine benefits Israel. So the fact that the media is complicit in this, however, and is propagating this, really, especially at this point, should be of no surprise to anybody. The media exists to be the mouthpiece for and generate consent for the American empire, of which Israel is a part of. Israel is subservient to, because it is a piece of, the American empire. It's the United States' personal little colony in the Middle East. We already discussed it this evening. We've discussed it in the past. Honestly, you probably should know that by now. And if you don't, well, I'm glad you're watching. So, they are complicit with this because they support the U.S. empire. And the reason they support the U.S. empire is because they are run by the bourgeoisie, who support the U.S. empire because they get the profits. They get their imperial super profits from the U.S. imperial occupation of the world and oppression of the world. So that's why it doesn't surprise me, and it probably doesn't surprise you to know that right off the rip, they start blaming Palestinians. The idea that the Intifada has been globalized, this is what the globalized Intifada means, is absurd, because at no point has pretty much anybody who's ever said globalized Intifada it wanted, intended, or meant for violence against Jewish people. Never. The first or second Intifada was not intended to cleanse, if you will, Palestine of Jewish people. And Intifada itself, again, means basically to resist or to rise up. The Warsaw Uprising, Warsaw Ghetto Uprisings were both Intifadas. That's what the word means. This is what it refers to. It's resistance to the violent occupation, and specifically the violent occupation of Palestine by the U.S. Empire, and before that, the British Empire, through this entity popularly known as Israel. Globalizing the Intifada means fighting Zionism and getting rid of, or resisting to the best of your ability, Israel. Last I checked, Israel does not exist in Australia. Last I checked, Israel does not exist in New York City. Last I checked, Israel does not exist in the UK, in Russia, in Bulgaria, and Denmark, two other countries we mentioned tonight. The only place Israel exists is Palestine. It exists on top of Palestine. So globalizing the Intifada does not mean, fighting Jews or killing Jewish people around the world, because it certainly doesn't mean killing Jewish people in Palestine. It means killing the resisting and overthrowing, and yes, it probably does involve killing, the violent oppression of the Israeli boot crushing the Palestinian neck. What that means, if you don't live in Palestine, is pulling that boot back by resisting and fighting against U.S. imperial aims. So if you're in the United States, that means preventing spending on Israel. It means lobbying or confronting your local leaders and elected officials who have the power to determine whether or not your tax dollars go to support Israel. It means sacking places like Elbit Systems. It means actually fighting the Israeli war machine. And this is what it has always meant, and this is what everybody who says it has always known it to mean. And, more importantly, this is what all of the detractors know that it means. These media voices are not saying, oh, globalize the Intifada is a call for violence against Jewish people, this is what leads to mass shootings, because they think that's true. They say that because they want you to reconsider or to worry that that might be the case, and they want you to have a knee-jerk reaction against or in favor of Israel against Palestinian resistance, because they want you to associate it with anti-Semitism and violence against Jewish people. It isn't, and it never has been. You can look it up. Hamas expressly decries violence against anybody based on religion, national origin, or ethnicity. So if Hamas, the military, the organization has a military wing called the Al-Qassam Brigades that is spearheading resistance against Israel, refuses to encourage and in fact actively denounces violence against Jewish people for their Jewishness, then we all have to understand, and most of us do, that calls for globalizing the Intifada, global resistance against Israel, does not and has never meant violence against Jewish people. But again, I know this, you now know this, state media knows this, but they want us to get confused, they want us to get resistant and hesitant to endorse the Palestinian Intifada and the Palestinian resistance because they want us to be scared. So that's all there is to it. Israel prostitutes violence, even as it commits it, in order to prop up its own goals, which of course are the end goals of the U.S. imperialist order. And they want the inattentive to believe their lies hook, line, and sinker, and will say and do anything they can in order to trick the public into ignoring the violence, hatred, and genocide perpetrated by the U.S. empire. Israel to advance plans for 9,000 units in occupied East Jerusalem, December 17, 2025, via Al Jazeera. Israeli authorities are engaging in multiple major efforts, including building settlements and pursuing annexation, to ensure that there will be no Palestinian state in the future. Israeli authorities are expected to advance plans to build 9,000 new housing units in an illegal settlement on the site of the abandoned Kalandia airport in occupied East Jerusalem, in another attempt to cut Palestinian lands from each other and block any possibility of a contiguous Palestinian state from ever emerging. So-called Adarat neighborhood in northern East Jerusalem, reminiscent of the E.P.A. plan to undermine Palestinian statehood, is to be discussed and have its outlines approved on Wednesday by the District Planning and Building Committee, according to Israeli group Peace Now. The advocacy group said the new settlement is envisioned to be built within a densely populated Palestinian urban area, stretching from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank and Kafr Aqab in the north through the Kalandia refugee camp, Ar-Aram, Bet Hanina, and Bir Nabala. It would build an Israeli enclave in an area where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians live in close proximity, with the aim of blocking development in a key area and further damaging the likelihood of a sovereign Palestinian state from being established. This is a destructive plan that, if implemented, would prevent any possibility of connecting East Jerusalem with the surrounding Palestinian area and would, in practice, prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, Peace Now said. Translation: the massacre government is working to establish a new ultra-Orthodox mega-settlement across the Green Line north of Jerusalem. The new political attack, called Adarat, is planned to be built in the heart of the Palestinian state that would be established alongside Israel. This involves 9,000 housing units that Israel will have to evacuate. The organization said the far-right government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is seizing every moment to bury chances for a future of peace and compromise. Especially now when it is clear to everyone that the ideas of managing the conflict and decisive victory have led to a security disaster for Israel, we must act to resolve the conflict. The plan's advancement date back to early 2020, when Israel's housing ministry sent it to the Jerusalem municipality to prepare it for approval. It completed the bureaucratic preparation process within months, but faced objections from the Environmental Protection and Health Ministries, according to Peace Now, which said the administration of United States President Barack Obama had also opposed it. It would need further government consideration and approval before being given legal effect and moving towards tender processes to select construction contractors. Most of the plan area is designated as state land by Israeli authorities, meaning they would not have to seek permission from Palestinian landowners. Israel has been quickly advancing with several major projects to build illegal settlements on occupied Palestinian territory and pursuing annexation of the occupied West Bank, alongside its genocidal war on Gaza that started in October 2023 and has now killed more than 70,000 people. The E.P.A. plan, which would see the construction of thousands of illegal Israeli homes in the occupied West Bank, is hailed by Israeli officials despite international condemnation. Israel's Security Cabinet last week signed off on plans to formalize 19 illegal settlements across the West Bank. Israeli forces continue to launch raids across the occupied West Bank and support violent settlers and attacking Palestinian lands while issuing permits to demolish Palestinian homes. Israeli authorities began carrying out demolition operations Wednesday morning in the town of Bidu, located northwest of occupied East Jerusalem, under the pretext that the Palestinian buildings lacked permits. In the central part of the West Bank, settlers, who have been rampaging with impunity, often backed by the Israeli military, burned Palestinian vehicles and wrote racist slogans in the village of Ein Yer Brud in Ramallah on Wednesday. Several Palestinians were also arrested during raids across the West Bank, including in Nablus. Local authorities said the Israeli military plans to demolish 25 residential buildings in the Nur Shams refugee camp this week. One of the really sad parts about this story is that if anyone else, any other country, any other territory, decided that they were going to turn an abandoned airport next to a city into new housing to create 9,000 new housing units, we would be celebrating. More and more housing needs to be built, especially in the United States and other places that are experiencing a so-called housing crisis. Of course, as an aside, the United States is not short on housing. It is short on available, affordable housing, which is deliberate by landlords and all that, yada, yada, yada. Not the point of this discussion, so I'm just going to gloss over that real quick. So it's sad that when we see massive housing being built, we know that it's in Israel or in Palestine by Israel. It's expressly in support of their genocidal intentions and their ethnic cleansing intentions, and to expand the occupation of Palestine and to dissolve even further the already splintered and shattered West Bank. Gaza gets a lot of attention, a lot of deserved attention, because of the immense violence going on there. I saw today that one study had put it up to 680,000 people killed in the Gaza Holocaust so far, and over 300,000 of them were children under 5 years old. And that number, of course, grows day by day by day, even during the so-called ceasefire that doesn't exist, because Israel has never ceased fire and has no intention of doing so. But the West Bank has it bad. The West Bank has it really bad, from continued Israeli occupation to a billion checkpoints. I think I remember reading that if Mary and Joseph traveled, as is described in the Bible, to Bethlehem from Nazareth for his birth and or technically I guess for the census in time for his birth, they would have had to pass through 9 Israeli checkpoints in the modern era. Of course, we all know Jesus was a Palestinian, anyway, whatever. Jesus was a Palestinian, arguably a socialist. Take that. So the checkpoints, the Swiss cheesing of the West Bank, the constant settler violence, 750,000 settlers who are illegally occupying Palestinian land, even by international pro-Israel standards, right? There are people in Israel who recognize the settlers and the settlements as illegal. There are Israelis, I should specify, Israelis in Israel who are opposed to the settlements because they recognize them as being unlawful and illegal. The UN has long derided them as being illegal. The United States, who has the power, doesn't give a shit, so they continue. And there's constant settler violence against the Palestinian people. It is not dissimilar from the U.S. or from the British colonization of the New World and American spread of that colonization, Manifest Destiny, and the genocide of the Native Americans. And every day we see violence against the Palestinians, from people getting beaten by Israeli settlers, people getting shot randomly by Israeli settlers, because they do not see Palestinians as being human beings. And the state of Israel, and of course the U.S. empire, is perfectly content to let the settlers get away with sheer, unabashed barbarism day in and day out, because it supports their national project, their imperialist project. And these housing units are expressly designed to expel Palestinians from their communities and from their native land and replace them. So if we want to talk about the Great Replacement or replacement theory, the only place that's actually happening is Israel, or Palestine. And they are ethnically cleansing these places. Ramallah has long been kind of the heart, or the political heart of Palestine, especially the West Bank. Although, of course, we know Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. Ramallah is kind of more of the de facto center. And fracturing Ramallah and its neighborhoods from other strongly populated Palestinian communities is designed to dissolve and fracture Palestinian sovereignty and their own national question. What this also does is the exact same thing that the kibbutzim set up right at the border of Gaza are intended to do. The article doesn't go into this, but I will inform you. The settlements that were erected right on the border of Gaza, the settlements that are being built right on the border of Lebanon, that Israel is now importing people from India to populate. Look it up. It's bizarre. Exist, and now this new one that they're being built in so-called East Jerusalem, exist in order to put Israelis and Jewish people at large directly into harm's way from people who resist the Zionist project. This is also why the headquarters of Mossad and their military are right in the center of downtown Tel Aviv. So that way, anyone who tries to attack, very realistically, will harm civilians. So these border towns that were erected and then taken over by Hamas on October 7th, these border towns being built in Syria and in Lebanon, these invasive communities being built in the West Bank, exist so that way, when the inevitable anti-settler, anti-imperial resistance takes place, there are going to be people that are armed and ready to resist, or not resist, but armed and ready to repel or combat anti-imperialist fighters, but also are going to be there to get killed or injured in order to justify Israeli and American and British and Canadian, etc., mass violence against Palestinians. So, when some local West Bank militia, we'll say the Lion's Den, that's the prominent one that comes to mind, I think they're based in Jerusalem, inevitably fights these racist, violent settlers being put into East Jerusalem, that will be the casus belli for Israel to invade and then mass murder and indiscriminately destroy Palestinians and their livelihoods and their lives and their homes and their neighborhoods and their communities in order to violently expel them from the area with just cause of, they're violent, they're anti-Semitic, they hate us, they tried killing us, we have to obliterate them and destroy all of their people and incinerate and finish our final solution for the Palestinian problem. And then just ignite the Holocaust in the West Bank as well as in Gaza. And that is the reality of that situation. So, God forbid this goes through. I looked it up. It should have gone through by now. As the time of this recording, I don't have any reports that they did actually vote that through. We'll probably see in the morning Palestine time. If this goes through, if they are successful, if they start settling people in a year or two, remember that when eventually those people are threatened by the people that they occupy, the people that they oppress, that is why they have been put there. And when those settlers and when those occupiers, even the so-called innocent civilians, get hurt, it is directly because Israel wanted them to get hurt in order to justify the expansion of their colonial project. This is, again, another way that Israel is the number one perpetrator of violence against Jewish people, and is also why they support anti-Semitism the world over, because they like it when Jewish people get hurt, because it justifies, or seems to justify, the existence of Israel. And that's that. Another way you can support us is by following us on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. Trump administration seeks to begin screening social media of foreign tourists from 42 visa waiver countries. December 11, 2025, via ABC 7 News. Some visitors to the United States may soon have to provide their social media history from the prior 5 years to enter the country, according to a new Trump administration proposal. The proposal, posted on the Federal Register by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, suggests travelers coming from countries that are part of a visa waiver program would need to give additional personal information as part of an electronic application. The requirement would be for travelers using the Electronic System for Travel Authorization, or ESTA, as part of a visa waiver program for citizens from 42 countries, including the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Israel, and Qatar, as well as many other European countries. ESTA is an online application visitors from these countries use to travel to the U.S. for under 90 days without a visa. Visitors using the online system are currently asked for information such as their passport and birth date, as well as any past criminal record. The proposed changes to the visa waiver application include making provision of social media history mandatory and adding high-value data elements, including the person's phone numbers and email addresses over the prior 5 years, plus close family members' names and birth dates, along with their birthplaces, residences, and phone numbers over the prior 5 years. A question about entering social media information was initially added to the application in 2016, with a section marked as optional. If an applicant does not answer the question or simply does not hold a social media account, the ESTA application can still be submitted without a negative interpretation or inference, the CBP website now states. The new proposal, open for public comment through February 9, would make that information mandatory, though it's unclear how it would impact those wishing to come to the United States. CNN has reached out to the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees CBP, for comment. The changes would align with a broader push from President Donald Trump's administration to overhaul the country's legal immigration system, in addition to carrying out his long-promised program of mass deportation for people in the country illegally. The Trump administration over the past 11 months has made sweeping changes to nearly every facet of the immigration process, severely tightening every legal and illegal form of entry into the United States. The administration also has placed a heavy emphasis and scrutiny on the social media accounts of people in the U.S. on student visas. In June, the State Department told embassies and consulates they may vet applicants for student visas for hostile attitudes towards our citizens, culture, government, institutions, or founding principles. According to those guidelines, applicants are asked to set their profiles to public, and lack of an online social media presence could be seen as a negative that may be held against them in the application process. Just in time for the World Cup, and then for the Olympics in 2028. This is beyond absurd. I guess those J.D. Vance edits have actually gone to him after all. The United States does not need to know your social media history. Unless, and this is very arguable, unless you're posting, violent threats against Americans, and honestly, half the world has a lot of reason to say those things. There's no business that ICE, or I guess technically Border Patrol, has any reason to know your social media, especially over the last 5 years. First of all, tons of people change in the course of 5 years. You should. You're supposed to. That's what growing is. But this is just beyond absurd. How are we going to even do that for the millions of people we're expecting to come in as tourists for the World Cup next year? It's months away. And on the list is the UK. Are Team England fans going to come over and I'll happily come to the United States, pay $1 bajillion for a flight and for travel expenses and for room and lodging, and to go see all these games that my team may or may not, probably not, but may be playing in and winning. And to do that, I'm going to give all of my social media to the U.S. government. Are you joking? And this is just, I mean, where's the complaints about government overreach? This is absurd. And the things that they'll be looking for, like anti-American, not even anti-American sentiment. What's the hostile attitudes towards our citizens? Well-deserved. Culture? Well-deserved. Government? Well-deserved. Institutions? Well-deserved. Founding principles? Well-deserved. And what does that even mean? What is hostile attitude towards, like, our founding principles? Like hostile attitudes towards freedom and democracy, or hostile attitudes towards owning people as slaves? You know? Because that's America's founding principle. It's just absurd. And making this, you know, changing this from being mandatory to being, or from being optional to being mandatory. And, you know, you can really see my Spanish education here when we saying esta instead of however it's supposed to be pronounced. But, you know, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, at the very least, we're screening Israelis. Of course, we're probably screening them to make sure that they're not somewhat mildly critical of the U.S. or of Israel's government. Qatar, it's an interesting one to include in this article. It's so absurd. And it's for the visa waiver programs. These are all people from countries that we've already basically pre-approved for entry. Probably racist in its own right in some regard, or at least in intention when it was created. And, you know, you have to set your profile to public in order for them to check. What if you don't want to? What if your social media account is, I don't know, what if you're a Team England fan? Again, I'm thinking Team England because they're the one team out here that I could probably expect will actually make it to the World Cup. I guess I haven't checked. Let's say you're a Team England fan, but for whatever reason, you've been stalked for the past 5 years by your ex-boyfriend. And so, you know, you have stuff on your social media, but he's blocked, and you don't want him to see that. Well, now the U.S. government is saying, hey, you can't watch your team play sports live in the stadium that you're going to pay $1 bajillion to come do if you don't make your profile public. Really? So you're going to give up, you know, some semblance of safety in your home country in order to let the United States screen you to see if you're acceptable in the country? It's beyond the pale. And I don't even know what else to say besides keep repeating about how stupid and absurd and overreaching this is. Certainly, if any U.S. rival did this, if Iran did this, if the North of Korea did this, if China did this, we would not hear the end of it. It would be on every single news cycle about how evil and despotic and corrupt and controlling these places are. But, you know, I guess evil, despotic, and controlling is par for the course here in the United States of America, especially under the Trump administration, but, you know, not exclusively so. And it's all just to, you know, control and make sure that the people here in the United States who are coming for student visas, for tourism, for any other reason that they want, are not MAGA critical, I guess, is the best way to put it. Not necessarily aligned with MAGA, but not critical of them. It's thought control, it's thought policing. And frankly, I don't care too much about, you know, other people's social media coming into the country because, especially on like a tourist or a student visa, we have enough batshit people in the country and enough crazy students in the country. What's a couple more? You know, we already have Turning Point USA on like half the campuses in the United States. So if we get some guy from Hungary who's, you know, some kind of crazy conservative guy, what difference is he making? We already have goofball liberals at UC Berkeley, so who cares if the next one comes from Australia? right? We don't, like, what difference is this making? There aren't enough people coming to the United States who are not in alignment with U.S. values to make a difference, because there's already plenty of them here in the country. You know, if you're going to be screening for people who have J.D. Vance edits on their saved to their phone, or criticisms of the U.S. government on their social media, that's me. So, you know, what do I care if there's another one coming into the country? Honestly, you don't need another one of me, I guess. But, you know, the person of that ilk. So it's short-sighted, and it's going to create a lot of work for Border Patrol and for a lot of people. Probably may or may not back up the visa waivers. So there's some people who, you know, even if they follow all the rules, might just be stuck in line to get their visa. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. I can't emphasize that enough. It's stupid. It's an infringement on freedom of speech, freedom of expression. It's an infringement on, you know, human rights to express themselves. And it's short-sighted, and especially coming up on the World Cup. And, of course, the Olympics in 2 years. I could go on about all the stupid things we're doing about the World Cup, but it's the biggest sporting event in the world, and we're screwing it up. Qatar. Oh, was it Qatar last year? Or last time? I think it was Qatar. Qatar didn't even screw it up. Come on. Trump signs AI order to shut down state laws, December 11, 2025, via Politico. President Donald Trump signed an executive order Thursday mobilizing the federal government to fight state limits on the fast-growing artificial intelligence industry. The move is intended to boost the growth of American AI companies, which have been eager for a national law rolling back the increasing number of state-level regulations that have cropped up around the technology. The order drew overwhelming praise from the tech industry, but a fast rebuke from critics, including lawmakers in both parties, who say the federal government is not doing enough to address the dangers that AI poses. California Governor Gavin Newsom, who recently signed his own sweeping AI regulation, accused the president of signing an executive order directly benefiting people in his circle. President Trump and David Sachs aren't making policy, they're running a con, said Newsom, referring to Trump's AI and crypto czar, a Silicon Valley investor who helped shape the policy and attended the signing. California had previously threatened to challenge any order. New Jersey Governor-elect Mikey Sherrill, a Democrat whose state recently passed rules related to AI deepfakes, also waded in, accusing Trump of lawlessness. Once again, the president is taking what should be a bipartisan issue and turning his back on the American people to curry favor with big tech CEOs, Sherrill said in a statement. Several groups representing the tech sector quickly threw their support behind the document, though some focused their praise on a provision directing the White House to work with Congress to create a national AI framework. The best way to remove barriers to AI innovation and adoption is through legislation grounded in areas of consensus, said Craig Albright, Senior VP of U.S. Government Relations at the Business Software Alliance, which counts Microsoft and OpenAI among its members. Preempting state AI laws has struggled to gain traction in Congress, where even some Republicans oppose the idea of plowing over state AI regulations. Two previous efforts this year collapsed, in part because of intra-GOP opposition to tacking language onto must-pass legislation. The order is largely similar to a draft that leaked in November, empowering the Department of Justice, Federal Trade Commission, Commerce Department, and other agencies to target states that pass AI laws, an aggressive strategy that could expose the White House to legal challenges. A newly added section says the White House will not push for a federal law that preempts state AI regulations meant to protect children, address data center concerns, or involve state government procurement in use of the technology. The order also removes language that called California's new AI safety law complex and burdensome. Many tech companies want to include similar language from that law, known as SB 53, and any federal AI law, as well as rules passed by other states. In the immediate wake of its release Thursday night, most elected critics of the order were Democrats. The Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a Republican who is pushing his state to enact a slate of AI regulations, has been one of the most outspoken Republican governors against any attempt to preempt state laws. Some fissures within the tech industry began to show in the hours following the executive order signing, which could signal a bumpy road ahead. There are valid reasons to have national laws, but this needs to be done by Congress, a tech industry lobbyist, granted anonymity to speak candidly, told Politico. This is definitely a strong-arm version of an executive order, the lobbyist said, adding that legal challenges were likely. Other Democrat lawmakers quickly pounced on Trump's executive order, with some threatening legislative action against the White House. Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii lambasted the order as absurd and dangerous, adding that he plans to introduce a bill to repeal the executive order in the coming days. Wow, I'm agreeing with the Catholic Church and Ron DeSantis in the same day. Must be something in the water. The resistance to states being able to regulate AI is, again, like the last article, absurd. And at least we now know, or can speculate, how the U.S. government expects to process all of these immigration requests, all of these visa waiver requests, how they're going to comb through everybody's, social media lives is probably through these data centers and these AI programs. That's why the U.S., was it the military, is now promoting AI with go to, I'm not even going to guess at the website just in case I get it right. Encourage people to go there. Go to the military AI website, basically, and play around. And, it's just the ceaseless promotion of AI and the data centers in order to, create wealth for his corporate buddies. And it's, everybody in America pretty much can see that, well, this is a bad idea. In my experience, there are not a lot of people who think AI should go unchecked. There are people who may have differing or may disagree and have differing opinions on how much regulation or to what extent is too far. But by and large, the American public does not think that AI unchecked 100% is a good thing. I mean, again, we have literally Ron DeSantis saying, yeah, well, we need to have some regulations on this. Your rules against deepfakes. Of course, it's one of the big threats to women, and to a lesser extent, probably to men as well, is the ability for a person to use these computer programs to create fake pornography of people that they know. There's a problem in Korea, the south of Korea, a couple months ago, I think, where it was a big thing amongst students, primary school. Primary school? No, primary school is too young. But middle school, I guess high school is part of primary school, right? I don't know. Like middle school and high schoolers creating deepfake pornography of their classmates, all of whom, of course, were young children. And, the big tech bros who are supporting this, what's this guy's name? David Sachs. The Trump's AI and crypto czar. First of all, I hate that. I hate the czar. Both the real ones, all of them pretty much. Bolsheviks did nothing wrong with shooting them. But I hate that they call everyone czar. I don't know where that term came from. First heard it applied to Kamala Harris as the border czar. I hate that term. And the AI and tech czar is such a stupid, stupid thing. Who thought that was a good idea? If anything, that implies to me someone who is evil, corrupt, and despotic, like every single czar was. So, whatever. I digress. That's a digression. But, these guys are the ones who are benefiting from it while the rest of us burn, or more realistically, die of dehydration and the cold now, as these data centers are just sucking up water and power. And a little known or a little discussed side effect of this, and it probably will be discussed pretty soon by the large and general public, is that the demand for RAM and processing power for these data centers, that of course are being used for genocide in the Middle East and for screening and scanning people's data by ICE and everything, the demand for these has created a chip shortage. And as a result, next-gen laptops and phones are relying on significantly smaller data packages and memory, which, of course, in turn is just another way for them to sell cloud storage space to us, or it's more rent-seeking behavior from these corporations. And then, if all of the available physical devices that create memory are owned by some corporation in a warehouse, rather than actually in your phone or laptop at your house, then they can sell you or more accurately, rent you that storage because they physically kept it from you. It's one of the things that they've been doing for a while. I think it's going to get a lot worse. I think I saw Snapchat is going to start charging people to store their memories or whatever on there. Things like that. So these data centers that are popping up, that are being used to program AI or operate AI for very little public benefit, and very much so to the benefit of the bourgeois and the imperial state and the surveillance programs, are just robbing Americans blind. They're taking our power, they're taking our water, they're taking our physical space. Homes are being bought out and bulldozed for these data centers. And it's creating pollution. And all of it is, now going to be, or now Trump is demanding that it can't even be regulated. So, if you ever wondered whether or not Trump was really draining the swamp, or as another politician who's in it for the money and for his corporate sponsors, there's your answer. He's in it for his corporate sponsors. Of course, if you're watching the show, you probably had no doubt about that in the first place. But it's just another grab from the federal government. And, it goes back to these stupid states' rights people. We're going to see whether or not they actually are going to support states' rights to regulate AI, or if they're going to say, oh no, we need big government to not regulate AI because my team, the Red Hat team, says that, our supreme leader says that we don't need to regulations. I don't know. At this point, I don't know. Maybe I'm inventing people to be mad at this point. But it's stupid, it's short-sighted, it's harmful to the general public, and it's not going to result in anything good for us. We need regulation on this for, not just safety and security purposes, for, our digital footprint, but also for to secure and keep safe our water tables, our land use, our neighborhoods, our power, etc., etc., etc. And regulation is really, really important, as we discussed, I think, last week regarding, and the week before, regarding the FDA and food and cheese, and our, just as examples of our daily needs relying on government regulation. We need regulation on AI. We can't have it unregulated. It's already leading to bad places. And any attempt to force a non-regulation of AI, not even deregulation, non-regulation of AI, is directly opposed to the interests of the public. Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of The People's Report. Don't forget to subscribe at solidaritytelevision.org. Organizing the working classes of the world, in solidarity forever.